All too often today, the Constitution is wielded as a weapon, breathlessly invoked by one partisan side or the other in service of some narrow political objective, often with limited curiosity about its history or even the actual text of the document. Today, I want to return to the Constitution, to its framers, and ultimately to its lessons for us today. And by recovering that history, we will find that many of our commonplace assumptions about the Constitution are myths that need to be debunked, and hidden truths will be revealed. So let us turn the clock back to the summer of 1787, when the delegates convened here in the Pennsylvania State House on Chestnut Street, what we know today as Independence Hall. You know, we often make a mistake when we think about history. It's a subconscious error. We don't realize we're doing it. On some level, we assume that historical figures knew how their future would play out, that when the delegates came together in Philadelphia, they knew with confidence that they were embarking on an experiment that was sure to endure in perpetuity. But the truth is that their knowledge of their future was as impoverished as our own. Just as we are constantly buffeted about by unexpected current events, so too were they. And from the vantage point of 1787, it was not at all clear that America would survive much longer as a nation. At that time, we were governed by the Articles of Confederation, and the Articles were failing. Under the Articles, there was no judiciary branch that could adjudicate disputes between citizens of different states. There was no executive branch to enforce the laws. It was more of a league of loosely connected mini-countries. In order to pass any legislation under the Articles of Confederation, you needed total unanimity across the states, and tiny Rhode Island kept unilaterally sinking endeavors that were otherwise uniformly supported by the rest of the country. And this kind of political disorder soon led to violence, notoriously in Shays' Rebellion, starting in late 1786, when a ragtag militia of farmers in western Pennsylvania took up arms against the state. And the federal government proved wholly impotent in suppressing the insurrection. Ultimately, a mercenary army had to do the work. And so, from the vantage point of the delegates in the summer of 1787, the Constitutional Convention looked perhaps less like a surefire start of a legal charter that would last for centuries to come, and more of a last-ditch, 11th-hour bid to salvage a republic that seemed perhaps at the risk of dying in its very infancy. And so with that sense of the framers' perspective, their limited perspective, as we all have about our futures, that palpable sense of contingency of history, let us turn to the work of debunking some of the enduring myths that continue to cloud our understanding of this document. So myth number one, we are supposed to have three co-equal branches of government. The idea of co-equality of branches is an article of faith. You can find it referred to in many judicial decisions from the federal bench. And it's wrong. It's historically inaccurate. The founders did not want three co-equal branches. To be sure, they instituted a system of checks and balances to ensure that no one branch would dominate the others. But that doesn't mean that they wanted all of the branches to stand upon a perfect equality. And to make my case for debunking this myth, I want to turn to the Federalist Papers. And in case anybody here might be joining us from the broader community and maybe is more than a semester or year removed from their most recent civics class, I'll just briefly give you a very short synopsis on the Federalist Papers. On September 17th, 1787, the delegates signed their names, as Dr. McNamara mentioned, to the Constitution. It's just ink on parchment. It had no legal force. Only if at least 9 of the 13 states ratified the Constitution would it take legal effect, and even then, only in the states that actually ratified. And so Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison team up, writing under a shared pseudonym, Publius. They produce a series of 85 essays designed to rally New Yorkers specifically to send pro-Constitution delegates to New York State ratifying convention. Why New York? Well, New York was particularly important. People in Virginia will tell you how important Virginia was, and it was very important. But New York was central to the Union geographically, commercially, politically, and support for the Constitution was deeply contentious in that state. So it was essential to rally people to send pro-Constitution delegates to that ratifying convention. And the Federalist Papers, which are a kind of exegesis of the constitutional text, are some of the most important sources we have for interpreting the document. So what might the Federalist Papers have to tell us about the notion of co-equality between the branches? Where here is James Madison in Federalist 51. He writes, "In Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates." So we have Congress, according to him, as the most important branch of government. And here's Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 78. "The judiciary is beyond comparison the weakest of the three departments of power." So if we have Congress as the most important and the judiciary is the weakest, we have the presidency in the middle, right? And we can see this idea reflected in the text of the Constitution, right? The Constitution invests Congress with the power of the purse. They make the president the commander-in-chief, but the judiciary has no similar tools at its disposal to enforce its own opinions. If we look at the text of the document, the very first article is about Congress. The second article is about the executive branch, and the third article about the judiciary. And indeed, the longest of those three is about Congress, then the presidency, and by far the shortest is Article 3 concerning the courts. None of this is coincidental. Why would the framers want three unequal branches of government? Well, we have to look back to their experience as British subjects under colonial rule. During the era of British rule, the governors of the colonies were selected by the crown, and the judges were selected by those governors. So both the judiciary and the executive were functionally extensions of royal power. But in the colonial era, the local legislatures, the assemblies, they were selected by the local colonists. And so Americans had been primed through 150 years of British colonial rule to see legislatures as uniquely representative of their interests and their liberties. And so it should be little surprise to us that they would invest Congress with the lion's share of power. And one of the extraordinary developments from my perspective as a constitutional historian over the last couple hundred years, and I'm not telling you how to feel about this, you can like this or not, that's your prerogative, I'm just the messenger here telling you what the history was. The scope of judicial and executive authority has grown far beyond what the framers initially envisioned. So that's myth number one. Let's turn to myth number two, which is that the rights in the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, these are in the First Amendment because they are our first and foremost rights. Almost every year, some law professor will come out with a book that's entitled something like First Freedoms, Church and State, or First Freedoms, Freedom of Speech. The truth is that the rights that we know in the First Amendment today were actually initially in the Third Amendment. And they only became part of the First Amendment by default because the first two amendments to the original Bill of Rights didn't get ratified. The real First Amendment was an algorithm for determining the size of congressional districts. And the original Second Amendment had nothing to do with guns. That amendment specified the conditions under which members of Congress could vote to increase their own salaries. Wasn't ratified. And so the Third Amendment bumps up to the first. And so it's a nice little rhetorical flourish to call these freedoms our first freedoms, and they are our paramount freedoms. I don't gainsay that. But it is an accident of history that they wound up in what we know today as the First Amendment. So let's delve deeper into the text of the First Amendment to debunk yet another myth. If you ask most Americans, many of them polled on the street will tell you that the phrase separation of church and state appears in the text of the U.S. Constitution. In fact, it does not. This is the language that we have. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. So where does this language of separation of church and state come from? And how is it that it came to be conflated with the Establishment Clause? Well, to answer that question, I have to tell you the story of the so-called mammoth cheese. On New Year's Day in 1802, Thomas Jefferson, then sitting as president, receives at the White House a massive wheel of cheese. I know you're thinking, Porwancher, I've seen some pretty big pieces of cheese. I don't think you've seen a piece of cheese like this. It was 17 feet in circumference. It weighed over 1,200 pounds, and emblazoned on its crust were the words, "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God." So a local poet publishes a poem at that time in the newspaper about the mammoth cheese. And he writes, "But muse, you'll not forget to squeeze a word about the mammoth cheese. Such cheese no man before set face on. 'Tis bigger than Don Quixote's bason. Such cheese, my stars, 'twould make one swoon. To view 'tis bigger than the moon. This cheese is surely honored more than ever any cheese before. To feel the weight and force, forsooth, and crash of presidential tooth. Ye maggots that dwell in the cheese, with horror how your limbs will freeze, how you will kick and squirm and claw beneath the Jeffersonian jaw." Now, what does a massive wheel of cheese have to do with constitutional history? Everything. The cheese was a gift from a preacher to thank Jefferson for his commitment to religious liberty. Now, Jefferson at that time had received a letter a few months prior from the Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut, complaining that the state government was discriminating against them relative to other religious denominations, and he hadn't written them back. But when he gets this massive wheel of cheese, inspired by the mammoth cheese and all that it represents, Jefferson is moved to put pen to paper, and he writes a letter back to the Danbury Baptists that forever changes the course of American constitutional history. And here is what Jefferson writes: "I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state." This is where we get the language of separation of church and state from Jefferson, writing nearly 15 years after the Constitutional Convention. So when Jefferson says that the Establishment Clause mandates a separation of church and state, is he speaking for his generation, or is Jefferson doing what politicians sometimes do, which is to conveniently see in the text of the Constitution, happily, a mirror of their own personal political preferences? Well, to be sure, Jefferson was not alone in advocating for the separation of church and state. James Madison adopts very similar views. There are yet others. But that was just one of multiple competing schools of thought at that time. And to find an alternative vision of church-state relations, we need look no further than the father of the country, George Washington. Now, Washington was as fervently committed to religious pluralism as any of the founders, but he also believed that government and religion could nurture a mutual bond. So what does the Washingtonian principle look like in practice? Well, if you go back to the 1780s, even before the Establishment Clause, Washington articulates just such a perspective when the state of Virginia, his home state, was considering the passage of a bill that would require people to lend their tax dollars to Christian schools. And Washington writes, "I am not amongst the number of those who are so much alarmed at the thoughts of making people pay towards the support of that which they profess, if of the denomination of Christians." And here the language is crucial: "or declare themselves Jews, Mohammedans," meaning Muslims, "or otherwise, and thereby obtain proper relief." In other words, non-Christians would be exempt from this tax. And so we see here Washington wedding the principle of respect for minority faiths with the idea that government and religion could be mutually supportive. And Washington isn't alone in these views. Alexander Hamilton also advances the idea that government and religion should work toward common ends. In 1796, as Washington is preparing to step down as our nation's first president, he tasks Alexander Hamilton with ghostwriting his farewell address. And Hamilton drafts a paragraph that many scholars consider to be Washington's single most important statement on the relationship between politics and faith. And it's not just Hamilton's words. Washington gives him edits. They go back and forth with multiple drafts. And here's what they come up with collectively in the famous farewell address. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness. And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. You would be hard-pressed to find the likes of a Jefferson or a Madison articulating a sentiment like this. And what's really interesting is that as you move forward into the 19th century, by the mid-19th century, the people who pick up the Jeffersonian mantle of separation of church and state aren't those who have the most compassion for minority faiths. It's actually the people who are the most anti-Catholic. So during that time, America is rapidly industrializing, and many Catholic immigrants from places like Ireland and Germany are pouring into the country to take up these new industrial jobs. And there is some faction of native-born Protestants, not everybody, but there is a faction that feared that these Catholic immigrants were the front lines of a papal invasion, that they would be loyal to the Vatican over and above their adopted homeland of America. And so these Protestants start championing the separation of church and state in a bid to keep the Catholics in check, for fear that the Catholics would seize the levers of state power and make America some sort of province of the Pope. And so the separation of church and state, it becomes this reactionary, anti-Catholic, xenophobic ideal. And only later in the 20th century does it get recast as this secular ideal. And it happens in a landmark Supreme Court decision called Everson versus Board of Ed. And here is Justice Hugo Black interpreting the Establishment Clause. He says, in the words of Jefferson, the clause against establishment of religion by law was intended to erect a wall of separation between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable. We could not approve the slightest breach. So in this Supreme Court decision, Hugo Black takes Jefferson's letter, written 15 years after the Constitutional Convention. He takes this language from the letter to the Danbury Baptists and he elevates it to constitutional status. Hugo Black writes out of the history the diversity of opinion among the founders on church-state relations. And it's also a little bit curious that he picks Jefferson, of all people, to be the sole arbiter of the meaning of the Establishment Clause, because Jefferson was highly idiosyncratic when it came to religion. He rejected the idea that Jesus was the Son of God. It's not a mainstream Christian belief. He was deeply anti-clerical. He thought much of the Bible didn't happen, crossed out the parts of the Bible that he rejected, and retitles it The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. He is an odd choice to be taken as the sole spokesperson for the founding generation when it comes to religion and politics. Now, I am not here arguing today in favor or against the separation of church and state, or in favor or against any other position. That's up for all of us to decide as citizens. But I am here as a historian to say that if we're going to have our jurisprudence premised on history, it has to be done on a faithful reading of the historical record that is alive to that record's nuances and complexities, instead of cherry-picking evidence to support some sort of predetermined legal conclusion. So, moving on to the next myth. We're making good progress. The next myth is that the Free Exercise Clause is the most important clause for protecting religious freedom in the Constitution. And I would argue that that's actually wrong. that there is a different clause, lesser known, buried in the text of the Constitution that is far more important for protecting religious liberty. And it's found here in Article 6, Section 3. No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. Well, why would a clause that only pertains to that small sliver of people seeking federal office be more important than the free exercise clause, which applies to everybody? Well, to answer that question, we have to look at the original state constitutions. When the American Revolution begins, the colonies are no longer colonies, they're self-governing states, so they go about drafting state constitutions for themselves. And many of them have something akin to the free exercise clause that prefigures what we'll later see in the Bill of Rights. So in 1776 in Pennsylvania, they ratify a constitution that reads, "No authority shall in any case interfere with or in any manner control the right of conscience and the free exercise of worship." But that same state constitution introduced a exclusionary oath of office for the state legislature, which required the following words: "Each member, before he takes his seat, shall make and subscribe to the following declaration. I do acknowledge the scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration." Which begs the question, how free is the exercise of one's faith if you have a civil disability imposed on you for exercising your religion? And so you might be thinking, well, maybe that's just Pennsylvania. Do you have any other swing states? Let's go to Georgia. All persons whatsoever shall have the free exercise of their religion, right? That's all well and good. What does Georgia have to tell us about the eligibility for the state legislature? The representative shall be chosen out of the residents in each county, and they shall be of the Protestant religion. So it walls out Jews and Catholics. And you might be thinking, okay, well, those are the swing states. How about a non-swing state? Well, let's go up to New York. The free exercise and enjoyment of religious profession and worship without discrimination or preference shall forever hereafter be allowed. And yet that same state constitution required that Catholic immigrants forswear their allegiance to the Pope, not just in a political sense, but in an ecclesiastical sense as well. And New York had blue laws that forbade work on Sunday. So if you were Jewish, you couldn't work on Saturday because of your faith, or on Sunday because of state law, meaning you could work 52 fewer days a year, about more than 7 weeks worth of lost income. You were functionally paying a tax for being Jewish. One particularly enlightened assemblyman in the New York State Legislature tried to rally his fellow delegates against the blue law. He said, "This was not equal liberty, one of the boasted blessings of our government." But his appeal fell on deaf ears. And so it is against that backdrop that we see that abstract promises of religious liberty might actually mean very little if they're not followed up with concrete grants of equality. But in the U.S. Constitution, they take the radical step at the convention of banning religious tests of any kind for office, appointed or elected. It is a remarkable advance in the history of religious liberty. Now, it should come perhaps as little surprise that when the delegates reveal their work, which had been kept secret over the summer, and the Constitution gets sent out to the states for ratification, opponents of the Constitution, which were dubbed anti-federalists, tried to scaremonger people about the ban on religious tests. And one delegate at the Massachusetts ratifying convention said, "A Turk, a Jew, a Roman Catholic, and what is worse than all, a universalist may be president of the United States." But despite these voices of intolerance, the voices of enlightenment carried the day, and the Constitution, including its revolutionary ban on religious tests, was made the law of the land as it still is today. We often think about the Constitution. We read the Constitution in light of our modern day political controversies, naturally so. And of course, we want the Constitution to solve our problems, to give us clear guidance, to answer our questions for us. that I would submit to you that the point of the Constitution isn't to resolve our debates. It is to establish legislative halls and courts of law where these debates can proceed peacefully. What the founders understood is that when debate ends, violence begins. That when people stop yelling at one another, they start firing at each other. The Constitution that they bequeathed to us was crafted in an era whose politics were as fractured and toxic as our own. And so they crafted a Constitution where we can continue to have legal, peaceful disagreements, because the alternative is bloodshed. The founders had lived through a war. They knew firsthand that when debate ends, carnage ensues. And so they wrote a Constitution not to resolve our debates, but rather to keep them going. We may lament the state of our politics in 2024. We have two sides wherein each believes that if the other comes to power, they'll destroy America from the inside out. Well, that's nothing new in American history. That's what the Federalists and Anti-Federalists believed about each other. It's certainly what Hamilton and Jefferson thought about one another. We have always disagreed about the proper relationship between citizens and between those citizens and their state. And we always will. But so long as the disagreement continues, the Constitution, in a very meaningful sense, has succeeded. We are hundreds and even thousands of years younger than other societies around the world. And yet no other country on earth has a national constitution that has been in effect longer than ours. Its longevity is an extraordinary testament to its success, not in resolving our debates, but in institutionalizing them. At the close of the convention, when Ben Franklin left the Pennsylvania State House, a woman stopped him on the street, and she referred to him as doctor. He'd got an honorary doctorate from Oxford, and she said, "Well, doctor, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" And Franklin famously replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." Today, more than 200 years since Franklin issued this challenge, the Constitution endures, the republic abides, and the debate lives on. Thank you.